Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Howard here, back with another edition of Those Were the Days Extended. And today we are going to take a little bit of a deep dive into a relationship that is one of my favorites, with one of my favorite, or two of my favorite characters, actually. And then we're going to do a little critique of this relationship because I think, as much as I loved it, I do think that, let me fix this. As much as I loved it, I do think that there was some room for improvement with this one. And speaking of, what I am talking about is the father-son relationship between Brandon and Abe specifically, and also how this relationship sort of helped bring in a different side of Abe. We got introduced to the character of Brandon, but it also sort of reverberated with other characters on the show. We're going to talk about the Walker Mendez extended family here in the history, and then we're also going to talk about other relationships that formed because of this sort of pairing between these two guys, which at the tail end of this run sort of wasn't it sort of ended just as I personally feel like it was just getting started and just getting going, and I feel like they never gave it its due. But again, we'll talk about that a little later. But yeah, what made me it sort of brings us to, in this particular picture, is June 3rd, 2003, when we sort of said goodbye to Brandon Walker. Is, of course, if you don't know, this is Abe's firstborn son that he actually didn't know about, played Brandon Walker here, played by Matt Cedino, who originated the role in 1999. And like I said, this is sort of their sort of goodbye the first round. Brandon eventually did come back a couple other times, but I want to focus on sort of the first period of him being on the show, and that was the 1999 to this 2003 sort of portion. This was a majority of Brandon on the show. The other times he came back, he was kind of in and out for a few months here, but yeah, kind of want to just examine this relationship. Like I said, Macedino was great in the role of Brandon, but there's a little bit of some family history. If you don't know the character Brandon, or if you don't remember the family history, take you down a little bit of memory lane here. And it all started here with these two, and that, of course, is James Arnold as Abe Carver. And this lady here is Valerie Wildman, who you guys remember as Faye Walker. She is the mother to Brandon, Nicole, and Taylor, actually. And these two it sort of started with these two way back when in Salem. And this is when Faye here was married to a man named Paul Mendez. They had three children, of course, again, Brandon, Nicole, and Taylor, and Faye was played by Valerie Waldman. And Paul essentially was this very sort of abusive man, not only to Faye, but also to the three children, Brandon, Nicole, and Taylor. And at the time, Abe was a rookie cop who used to sort of respond to all these sort of abuse claims or abuse phone call 911 calls when they would get them. So he was sort of frequently sort of in their house and around them, because Paul was, again, abusive husband, abusive to the kids, and Faye would always sort of you know, typical trope of sort of abusive wife, doesn't want to press charges, doesn't want to see him go to jail, was stuck in that sort of cycle of abuse and Stockholm syndrome and all that. But what developed because of this is that Abe and Faye sort of got close. He felt sort of very protective over her in the family, and they actually end up having an affair. Well, actually, they end up having an affair first, and then sort of the children come, and it becomes this ongoing thing. But we later find out that Abe is, in fact, Brandon's biological father. Brandon actually is the oldest. It's Brandon, Nicole, and then Taylor as the youngest. And if you don't remember Taylor, she's come on during a few stints, but she was most memorably played by Tamara Braun in her first go round with Days. She actually played Taylor Walker, Nicole's little sister, and had a relationship with EJ, and actually Eric too, a little bit, sort of there at the beginning. So yeah, that is sort of how the Walker clan. We of course know Nicole came on in the mid '90s by herself. She was a poor, sort of struggling waitress who runs into Eric as a photographer. He takes a liking to her, and then she also runs into Sammy, who actually sort of gives her her first job and allows her to be a model. Sammy at the time was running Titan. after she sort of put Victor or sort of caused Victor to have a stroke. She took over Titan, and that's how sort of we got Nicole into the mix. And then a couple of years later, they started to branch out a bit and started introducing her family, the Walkers, and that's sort of how we got Faye. We got Brandon first, and then Faye came along, and then Taylor eventually. But yeah, sort of when Brandon came on the scene, he very much was. Oh, sorry. Before that, I actually want to and this is what I was saying earlier. This is sort of a byproduct of the Abe and Brandon sort of relationship, him being her son. And one of the things that developed was not only the closeness and affair with Faye, of course, but what we saw over the years, which has probably gotten the most screen time, and that is actually sort of the relationship with Abe and Nicole here. It's always been very fatherly. It's also always been very, you know, Nicole hasn't had a father. When we did see him, he was a controlling, abusive man. And so this is I wouldn't say the primary relationship, but this relationship here has sort of given us the most screen time that has come of Abe sort of being revealed to be Brandon's father and having a connection with the Walkers, specifically Faye, but that Nicole always saw him as a father figure. Even when she was young, she used to look up at Abe as like the hero. He would sort of come in as a police officer and sort of put an end to the abuse, even if it was temporarily. Um, and I think Nicole and Abe have always had these just beautiful scenes over the years. This particular one that we're watching now, a photo of, this is when she thought that she had lost Jude a couple years ago, and Abe sort of going to visit her and comforting her over it. We've had many scenes like this over the years. One where Nicole sort of broke down when Abe was presumed dead a few years ago when he was kidnapped by Nurse Whitley, and sort of Nicole sort of learning how to deal with that, sort of losing a father figure. So these two have always been in each other's orbits. I think the last few years, they've really stepped it up in their scenes with them. There was that plot line years ago when the mask plotline where Kristen was pretending to be Nicole with the mask. Of course, we all remember that. And sort of Abe joined on as to work for Demira, I think running Demira security, and he sort of jumped on because he was worried about Nicole. He thought she was acting funny or in some sort of trouble within Demira, so he sort of planted himself firmly there to sort of help her and be her protector. So this has sort of been a nice byproduct. Again, this isn't sort of the main relationship that was of course with Brandon and Abe being the father, but this is the one, like I said, because Brandon has been in and out so much, this is the one that has gotten the most screen time out of all of them. So yeah, there's a little history there with the Walker clan. And I must say, when I remember thinking this when it happened, when I was watching the show back then. This is the late 90s when they brought Brandon on, and then they introduced Paul a couple years later. I remember thinking like, oh, isn't this just like a retreat of Austin and Billy? And in a way, yes. I think the writers were looking a way to expand the Nicole character from just having her eyes on money or stardom. This is when they introduced sort of Brandon. This was sort of at the tail end of the Eric situation. So coming in at an interesting place here. But yeah, I think they definitely differentiated them from sort of an Austin and Billy, and following their trope. They did have sort of they didn't have the absentee mother, but they had the abusive father who they were getting away from, and who sort of came back into their life to cause trouble. Paul Mendez sort of got Nicole hooked up with porn, sort of the same way Curtis did with Billy. So there are a lot of similarities with these two, but I think they were able to differentiate sort of Nicole and Brandon away from what we had just seen sort of transpire over the years with Billy and Austin and Kate during that time. But yeah, that was sort of the Walker family in a nutshell. But to get back to the actual relationship of Brandon and Abe. So when Brandon came on, he was sort of coming back to sort of check in on his little sister Nicole. At this point, this point in the storyline, 1999, Nicole is with EJ, and living at the Demir mansion. Brandon comes to town to again check on his little sister, see how she's doing. At this point, this is the mix of the craziness of of Sammy and EJ and Nicole thrown in the mix here. This is when we sort of get the beginnings of that triangle. Sammy becomes, I mean, not Sammy, but Brandon sort of becomes a little infatuated with Sammy. Um, and sort of takes a very good liking to her and pursues her at this time. Um, while Sammy's taken a little bit of a break from IJ, she's actually had her sights on Austin. So I won't get in. I'm not going to do the Brandon and Sammy saga. I think I've covered that before in a different video, or maybe I will in the future. But I just kind of want to focus on Brandon. But Sammy was a very, very big part of Brandon, his tenure on in Salem, especially during that first set here. But also what we saw when Brandon came on the scene was he knew of Abe, he knew who he was, and he sort of blamed Abe in his mind, or at least this is what we were told, which we later find out was a little bit of a twist here. We were told, or we were shown, that Brandon hated Abe because he felt like um Abe was the reason for Paul's anger and his abuse, and why he took it out on both Faye and the kids was because of the affair that Faye and Abe had with each other. So he sort of, in a weird, sort of twisted way, sort of blamed Abe for that, or at least in the beginning, that's what we, the audience, he was telling us and what we thought. So we went through this sort of period where Brandon just had it out for Abe. He'd have these very tense, sort of weird interactions with him. When Abe finally found out who he was in the relationship, not in terms of being his father, but in terms of being Faye's son, he tried to make amends with him. He tried to apologize. He tried to show it, should have tried to reason with Brandon from his perspective about him and his mother really did genuinely care for each other. And it was sort of the antics of Paul that sort of put them together in a weird way. But Brandon, of course, wasn't having it. He still had a lot of this resentment and anger toward Abe, which again, he was still playing it as, or at least telling us, in the other characters in Salem, that it stemmed from, not feeling like Abe sort of caused Paul to do the things that he did with the abuse. But in addition to that, he sort of, one of the things he also did, if you guys remember, he sort of wanted to like ruin Abe and his reputation. He sort of was bugged by the fact that Abe was such a revered, respected Salemite. So I know he sought out this guy who had got injured once when Abe was on the police force and was paralyzed. He sort of sought the guy out and encouraged the guy to go after Abe to sort of ruin his reputation and to sort of kill his like good guy, nice guy image. But the biggest sort of obstacle, I'd say, in sort of Brandon and Abe sort of coming together outside of the family history, and that, of course, was the relationship. Here we go. That, of course, was the relationship with Lexi, which ironically started out, I'd say, innocent enough. There was a little bit of not treachery, but a little bit of scheming on Brandon's side, where he sort of joined the hospital as a physical therapist. So he was working with Lexi a lot. This was when he was back and forth on and off with Sammy. Him and Lexi bonded. They were great colleagues. And they actually became really sort of good friends and actually became best friends on the show. And this was during an interesting time where Lexi was a little bit of like the town pariah, because this was the fallout of the Zach and JT sort of switch. And this was when the fallout of Lexi becoming evil and sort of embracing being a Demira. This was the fallout of it on the other side of it, where her and Brandon were close. I say the people she had sort of in her corner as she was trying to rehabilitate sort of her character and her image and her relationship with people. It was really, it was Abe, but to a point. It was also Celeste and, of course, Brandon as her best friend. But also Abe and Lexi were in a period where they were, not getting along, and she was still sort of clinging to what she did was right and all that kind of stuff. So this sort of sets the stage for Brandon to come in and sort of befriend Lexi, be her follow, be her support system. And then they actually end up sleeping together. Now, I want to clear something up here because I think I see people misquote this all the time, and they say that Lexi had an affair. She actually did not have an affair with Brandon. Her and Abe were actually separated at the time, and they were going through a divorce. Abe was they had broken up, separated. Abe was in his house. Lexi at the time was living at the Demure mansion with Celeste. At this point, Stefano was dead. So she was living at the mansion with Tony and Celeste. With sort of Brandon around all the time, again, as her support system. They sort of gave into their urges. Now, later we find out that Brandon sort of had a little bit of an ulterior motive. He did, of course, was Lexi's friend and did care for her, but part of it was also sort of sticking it to Abe by sleeping with his, estranged wife at this point. They weren't fully divorced, but they were separated and not together. So I do see a lot of people sometimes they lump Brandon into the affairs that Lexi had, but no, she actually did not have it. She's actually only had one affair, and that was really with Tech. The stuff with Jonah was more fantasy that she never acted on. This, of course, like I said, was her having a separation from Abe at the time. So her and Brandon got together, and this was the time that Theo was conceived. So what started as, Brandon sort of getting his like revenge on Abe. And again, we, the audience, don't know that he's Abe's father. We think it's because, he blames Abe and the abuse and all that kind of stuff. And he's just sort of mixed up or has a mixed up perspective on it. Lexi becomes pregnant, and it sort of played, and this is one of Days' best twists that they did. They sort of played it. I think we, the audience, were sort of watching this plot thinking it's a who's the daddy storyline of is it Abe or Brandon's, and how's that going to work out, and how's this going to go. And what actually happened was far more interesting. What it was is Lexi was pregnant with Theo, of course. Theo was always Abe's son, and Lexi knew that, but she played along with the not knowing because at the time, Sammy was trying to get back with Brandon. Lexi and Sammy were sort of at odds, and she sort of set it up with Tony's help, which was brilliant. She set it up that she was in question, the baby's fraternity was in question, so she knew that Sammy would sort of sneak into University Hospital, switch the results to make it look like Abe was the father, I believe, or make it, I forget which one, what her ultimate goal was, to like destroy that relationship, or did she want Abe and Lexi back together? I can't remember, but she switched the paternity results. Yeah, it was to make it look like, I think, or no, sorry, this is actually what happened. Now I'm remembering clearly now that it's going through my head. Lexi and Tony put fake results in showing that Brandon was the father. So when Sammy got there and to switch them, she would switch them to Abe being the father, and that sort of, she could have sort of Brandon to herself, and that Abe would be none the wiser, kind of a thing. What actually happened was it was one of those plots where we, the audience, thought the storyline was going one way, and then they had this scene with Lexi. She dials a number, calls Tony, and is like, the plan worked, or it's set in motion, or she fell for it. And then it sort of reveals that Lexi and Tony were in on this to keep Sammy away from Brandon, that Lexi knew the whole time that Abe was the dad, and that the thing with Brandon was just a fling, that, they didn't produce Theo from that. Theo was always Abe's son, and that, Lexi and Abe can sort of move forward with reconciling with each other and getting their marriage back on track. And then, of course, the secret is revealed that Brandon lets us know, which again, like I said, we didn't know, which was another twist to this, that the anger and the resentment wasn't just from the stuff with Paul Mendes. It was the fact that Brandon knew that Abe was his biological father, and he also sort of, in a weird way, felt abandoned by Abe, that him and his siblings and his mom sort of went through that abuse when Abe could have stepped in. Of course, Abe didn't know he was Brandon's father, so it created, again, this is sort of the conflict that Brandon came to the show with in regards to Abe. And this is why I say I think the storyline had so much more to it, and I really do wish that they would bring Brandon back. I know Macedino is really, really busy. He's from one show to another. He does movies. He's really popular, really gifted actor. I would love to see him back on the show as Brandon, but also if he's not available and they really, I think Brandon is due to come back. I wouldn't be mad at a recast, even if it's for a short time or to get Matt in for a few plot lines here and there over the years. That'd be great too. But I really think that this relationship, which again is the dominant relationship, but the one that has gotten the less screen time in a weird way over the years, I think sort of Brandon and Abe sort of made up at the end of this run from 1999 to 2003. It was a few years. As soon as sort of they make up and then Brandon forgives Abe forgives Brandon, they become a part of each other's lives. Sort of Brandon leaves town and it's like, okay, again, he's come back. I think he came back 2 years after that for like a short stint for a couple months. Then he came back another time for a short period, but he's never really cemented himself in Salem and stayed in Salem for a while. And I think, like I said, I think that this relationship could really use Brandon coming back. As we've seen on the show recently, sort of they built up the Carver family with Paulina and Johnny and Chanel. And then we've gotten Theo from time to time. They've hinted about bringing him back more permanently. We've had Lonnie and Eli, of course, but I'd love to see sort of Brandon come back and have sort of Abe with all of his children, which we've never really seen before. But I also think that this relationship, while they've continued it off screen, we always hear about Brandon. He was very instrumental in helping Theo when he was paralyzed, rehabilitate himself and get back. So that was great, but it also happened off screen. So we as the audience didn't get to see it. So we've just been I think we loved this storyline and we liked him being, we liked the idea of Abe having a son as he was, or finding out he was Brandon's father as he was welcoming a new son, Theo, into the mix. We liked the character of Brandon. We liked this relationship. It was just sort of short-lived in terms of screen time that I wish we would have gotten a little bit more of. But, fingers crossed with these new writers. I think they're really concentrating on family and bringing back people. And so, fingers crossed we see Brandon and the expansion of this relationship in the Carvers. But yeah, just kind of wanted to take a little walk down memory lane with this one. I've talked about Brandon before, but in context of Sammy or in Lexi's videos sometimes. But yeah, just kind of wanted to do this whole Brandon and Abe sort of storyline here. Again, short one, but I think it's reverberated in the past 25 years, like I said, with the expansion of the Walker family and specifically the relationship that Abe always had with Nicole. So yeah, again, hopefully we get a little bit more of the character Brandon sometime soon. So yeah, that was this week's Those Are the Days Extended, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.
Those were